Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. I'm Anthony Rowley, a former president of the club, and I'll be acting as moderator today. Today we were presenting another, what we call our deep dive events, in which we ask panels of experts to discuss topics of current interest and then invite questions in person and online. And the topic today is the threat which aging and declining populations present to Japan and other key countries in Asia. And we've got three experts here with us today to discuss this important issue. And I'll briefly introduce them in the order in which they were speaking. Excuse me, my voice is a little bit strange. First, joining us from Manila in the Philippines, of course, we have Aiko Kikkawa, who is Senior Economist, Economic Research and Development Impact Department at the Asian Development Bank, which of course is in Manila headquarters. And here in person on my right, we have Professor Naohiro Ogawa, who is a visiting fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute, the ADBI in Tokyo. And here in person also on my left is Jesper Koll, who's currently Global Ambassador and Export Director of the Monex Group, Japan, and the Japan Catalyst Fund. I just hope my voice lasts for the morning. Okay, I'll say a bit more about the speakers individually as I introduce them, but I think it's fair to say the subject of population aging and decline does not always get the attention that it deserves, with other things like climate change and geopolitical tensions and so on hogging the headlines. But I think for many people it's seen as a threat which is still some way off down the road. But we need to wake up to the fact that population aging and decline are more imminent threats than commonly supposed, and not least here in Japan. Which leads me to our first speaker, who was lead author of an important inaugural policy report from the ADB, which is entitled Aging Well in Asia, and also of related materials, which look in depth at the economic and social impacts of demographic changes. Dr. Kikkawa is, as I said, a senior economist in the ADB's Economic Research and Development Impact Department. Her research portfolio covers population aging and demographic change, international migration and remittances, and economic analyses of development projects. She currently leads the ADB's Technical Assistance Project, supporting the introduction and implementation of aging and retirement surveys in Asia. So, Aiko-san, if you would lead off, please. And may I remind everyone, if you have mobile phones, to put them onto manner mode or switch them off as a courtesy to our speaker. Aiko-san.
Okay. Thank you, Andrew. And good morning to all the participants. And thank you for the opportunity for ADB to present this report. Let me share my screen. Okay, can you hear okay? Can you see the screen okay?
Yes, if you can perhaps raise the volume just a little bit, that would be useful.
Okay, sure, I can do that.
Okay.
Okay, so yes, as Andrew just mentioned, sometimes people think population aging as a sort of elephant in the closet, something that you have to face but you haven't seen. But in this report, we really try to highlight that this issue is quite an urgent and something that is going to really, reshape our economy and the society. And we try to tell that story by highlighting and using some of the novel data that we collected throughout developing Asia. So in this report, Aging Well in Asia, which is just launched 2 weeks ago, really look at the state of well-being of older persons in the developing and emerging economies of Asia. And it tries to look at what then governments are doing, or that are we as a region of the developing Asia prepared to embrace a rapidly aging population. There are 5 key messages that emanate from our report. First is that developing Asia is aging rapidly, and which reflects development success in the region, extension of the longevity, better quality of life. However, we find that the region remains largely unprepared. Older adults are vulnerable to different types of disease, especially the lifestyle disease. There's a lack of decent jobs and constrained access to essential services such as healthcare and long-term care. And as I would present, the coverage of pension remained particularly low in the region, and that growing incidence of loneliness and social isolations are also reported. And second, this report really calls for the attention of the policymaker that we are going beyond the issue of the poverty, and really the agenda will be to ensure the well-being of older person. And what we mean by well-being, for older person, we stress that it involves at least 4 key elements. That is health, having productive life, and economically secured, and having engagement of family and society. Third, the report also highlights that there are large inequality among older people, and particularly vulnerable groups include older women, especially those who live alone, and also workers in informal sector who has no choice but to work till their health permits. Fourth, we find that healthy aging is central to this 4 elements of well-being, being that the good health really prevails and drives other 3 elements of well-being, that it drives productivity, it can also promote their social engagement, and also reduces the long-term care needs. But it's important to stress that this health in old age really depends on the choice that individuals make over the life course, not just in old age. So the policy agenda here is not to just focus on the older person's well-being, but how the entire population age, and it's a process. And fifth, the report calls for the urgent action of the government, and that to help and support its citizen age well. And this can be done through three-pronged approach. One is that lifelong, and its life cycle, and also targeting the whole of population. So maybe as you would have further discussion, I would present some of the background of what the state of population aging in Asia, and that discuss some element of the report. So what is the state of population aging in developing part of Asia? The population of older person who are defined as those 60 years old and above is going to double in the next 30 years to about 1.2 billion. And this would constitute about 1/4. So every 1 in 4 person would be an older person, even in a developing part of Asia. If you look at the speed of aging, the chart on the right shows that the period in which the share of older persons, 60s and above, would move from the 10% of the population to the 20% of population. It's perhaps not surprising that countries like Korea or Thailand are ahead of the demographic transition, already exceeding the benchmark of 20% by now. However, what is noticeable is that countries that are considered very young in population, large, so that onset to the transition of the population aging should be much taking longer, such as India or Indonesia, is also going to complete this process in 30 years. Another important thing to show is that the region does have large heterogeneity. So where and what to do in terms of population aging, the policies might also differ across countries in the region. So in the region, we have seen a drastic decline of absolute poverties, as you're aware. But if you look at the state of relative poverty, or the inequality, if I may say, older persons stand in a much disadvantaged position, as you see, where the orange bar stands the share of older people in relative poverty compared to younger generation or to the population as a whole. And what is more, we know that older people generally in our region live with the families. So this poverty data might not really show some of the disadvantaged older person who live in the multi-generation household, but actually remain poor. For example, we have many evidence of older women not be able to access household resources. So there's a different intra-household allocation of resources. So this data obviously does not show that. So we expect that the things are relatively more worse for if you really see the real situations. So with this, some limitation on what the poverty rate can show you in terms of defining what the well-beings are among older people, we want to focus a little bit more nuanced approach to understanding what the well-being is for the old age. And that's what this report is about. So well-being is a holistic and a multidimensional state achieved by meeting various human needs. And we looked at then what constitutes well-being at old age, and looked at literatures that examine the determinants of happiness, or what can bring people to the depression, different indicators. And they all tell us that these 4 elements matters. One is that he or she stays healthy and remain productive, economically secured, and socially engaged through families and communities. And among these, most important element, as I said in the beginning, is the health, as it really can help the level of well-being of the other 3 elements. So what we did in this report is to gather about the micro data of older person, which represent about 80% of all older groups, older people in this region, and to look at to give us some benchmark data on what are their state of well-being. And we find that if we're compelled to ask the question of, are we prepared? Some of the statistics as we present here are somehow indicating some alarming signs. So for example, in the domain of health, at least 57% of older persons report at least one diagnosed non-communicable disease. And these are diagnosed. So we expect that the actual situations are much worse. However, up to 60% are not receiving regular checkup. And many older persons also report physical limitations as they age. We expect about, our data shows about 20% of older persons at least have some difficulties performing some of the daily basic activities, but up to 43% of those with physical limitations are not receiving the care they need. When it comes to more financial aspect, we find that up to 94% of older persons in the region, for those who work, are finding work in informal sector, mainly agriculture, and also low productivity service type of work, which then leads to having not covered under some of the key social protections, such as compensation from the accident and injuries of work, or pension. And our data shows that up to 40% of older persons in the region do not have access to contributory or social pension, which is a cash assistance given to older person. Moreover, we find that due to the increased number of older persons who live alone or many other reasons, the incident of depression that comes from loneliness and others are on rise. And our data shows that about 16% of older persons report feeling lonely most of the time. So given this current scenario, we feel that the region can do much more to really review its policies and to respond by having some of the concrete reform in the key areas of the aging policies so that people will be able to invest for their old age from when they're young. So in this report, we have 4 chapters that look at each element. But if I give this presentation, it will take maybe about an hour. So let me focus on these 2 elements. One is the productive life and also economic securities, and to provide some policy discussion as a backdrop of this event. So in terms of the work patterns of mature workforce, we see the following pattern. So this bar shows the labor force participation rate of older person, but this is more of a mature workforce, age late 50s to early 60s by gender. And these are the list of countries in our members. You would also see the OECD benchmark at the bottom. What you see is that regions have such a variation in terms of how older person are participating in a labor force, both across the countries and also by the gender. In general, though, labor force participation of this male group is about 73% as on average, and for women, about is much lower at about 42%. And interestingly, you would expect that if longevity is extending, then would people be working longer? It doesn't seem to be the case for men. So this red diamond shows where this labor force participation were 20 years ago. And you see that many of the countries shows red, meaning that actually the participation have declined. There are many factors that explains this. For example, there's an income effect. These countries are experiencing income growth, and their families and family members who support them are also getting higher income. So this might give more incentive for them to retire. There are also other reasons that explain this. Another would be the pensions. And some of the countries provide pension, and growing number of them are providing pension, which allow them to retire at the age of 60s or 65 at the statutory retirement age. And there are many other factors. For some countries, it's the health, deteriorating health that explains lower participation, and many others. Interestingly, though, in contrast, for women, the general trend is on rise. And this can be generally explained by sort of a carry-through effect of the women working longer in their prime age, and that then they're working longer at the later stage. But then what it really shows is that this pattern of labor force participation among older person have so many confounding factors that the one factor really does not explain. And another point that I would like to point out in this chart is that this is an overall country data, and it does not really show how work patterns are different among informal and formal workforce. And that the general pattern here is that it's the informal workers who are working till much longer age because they do not have access to basic pensions or other social protections, labor rights, and that would compel them to work till very old age. Sorry, just go ahead. And then on the other hand, though, you would see that the worker in the formal sector are retiring much early, which explains some of the red diamond on this one. So in our report, we really go into this focus on this duality of labor market, that the circumstances of work are quite different among older person in informal sector, which predominantly work out of necessity, and the formal workers who are who would be retiring at a given age and might have other prospects in terms of the work. So let us speak first on the first group, which are predominant in our region and that need specific policies. So first is about informality of work. The left-hand side chart shows the share of older workers working in informal economy, and that the rate is about, on average, 94% in the region, but it can range from as small as 64% to about 99%. What you see is that, not surprisingly, but older women have a higher rate of being in informal market. And also older person are more likely to be in that position compared to workers in other prime age. And this pattern of formal and informal work and how different their labor force participations are is shown if we look at the data by rural and urban, by the location of their residence. So rural workers, if you see, have much higher labor force participation and also remain in the labor market longer, about at the age of 60s and 70s. And that really shows that they will be working longer and that would not have much access to pension for them to retire. So, and this would, this entails some of the policy that we want to look for, that how we can make the work for these workers less taxing, and that how could they be included in some way or another to a formal contributory pension or other social pension type, so that they'll be retired when their health does not permit them to work, or that when the work is too taxing for them. Let us now look at the situation of the formal workers. These are minorities, but it's expected to grow, if not exponentially, as the economy matures in our region. So this study is to look at the current level of, that's also what we try to look at here is that if formal workers are retiring at the age of the statutory retirement, and if they're not working longer, then those are sort of untapped resources for the society that they could, what if they could be working longer? So what is the size of older workforce who are healthy enough to work, but not working in the labor market? And that what if they are working, what is the possible economic contribution? So that we call it a silver dividend. And this is part of the study that we also worked with Ogawa sensei and also use the model that he had proposed earlier to really look at the untapped resources that older person can present. So what we did is that we look at the health conditions of older person, both in 60s and early 60s and late 60s, and to see how much % of them are able to work. And this, the total bar shows the share of people who are deemed healthy to work. And you see that quite a large country, it's like 80% or above, are, given their health conditions, they are fit to work. And what is shown in the orange portion of that is the people who are not working. We have microdata on these people, so we can validate what's the share of people who are healthy enough to work and working, and who are healthy enough but not working. So these are the untapped health capacity to work. And we have also monetized that by minimum wage. And this size of silver dividend, what if untapped workforce of older person are put it into economy and they'll be able to contribute? The size is quite large. So for example, in countries like India or Korea, it can boost the GDP by about the range of 1.5%, which is quite significant.
Aiko-san, if I could draw you to a close in say 3 minutes, that would be good. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Then we have other countries, but then on average about 0.9%, and on average about 1%, which is quite substantial. So in this area of work, we propose the following policies. First is in terms of the policies for the informal work. It's very important for this work to be less, the policy to address this strenuous work and to make them more age-friendly. And how to do that? It would be very important to safeguard labor rights and enabling pension access to informal workforce. And most of the workers do work in agriculture, and that this has to be supported through mechanization, perhaps, and that needs a good training and also a credit, which are currently not so available among older people. And second, for the worker, perhaps more on the formal sector who retire but are hoping to contribute and work longer, we would call for some of the policy that can enable longer working life and better jobs. That involves adjusting retirement age for some country who has not expanded that given reflective of the longevity that have extended in the countries. For example, in PRC, it's still 60 years old for men and 55 years for women. And that there's first, these ages are quite low given the China's longevity, and also that having a gendered retirement age also put women in a disadvantaged position because they're not, they have less years to contribute and would have less payoff at the retirement. And it's also important to enhance the employability through lifelong learning and skills development. And this should not start at old age, but at the young age. Everyone's aware of this 100 years life and that life shift stories. You would want to update your skill time to time in your mid-career to really make yourself having access to latest skills. And it's also important to review seniority practice that are still prevalent in Asia. I know that Japan has experimented many policies to remove the managerial post a person at given age, post-off system, which we also describe in a report, how you can incentivize employer to support more dynamic performance-based system of remuneration is actually also very key to retaining older workers, because one of the key problems that the firm face is that older workers would be too expensive to keep given their productivity if the firm still sticks to the seniority practice. We also say that making job more age-friendly would be very important through flexible work arrangement and to combat ageism. Let me then go to skip the pension coverage, but to go to the last slide. So here are some of the policy priorities that we stress from each of the well-being element, and that those are more highlighted in the report, along with some of the examples from the country that are already at the advanced stage of aging. The report draws quite a few lessons from Japan, Korea, Singapore, and for the benefit of the country that are going to experience aging. And here we stress very important point again, that it's really the early investment is the key to harnessing region's silver dividend, because health, skills, preparedness for the retirement, and also those communities and family engagement does not just come at the old age. It needs a investment of a lifetime to make it realized, and that we encourage the government and all the person themselves to invest on that. And we would, just for the promotion, we would have a more detailed discussion of our report at this time, so please join. And also the report can be downloaded from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot to digest there, but very interesting. Okay, let's turn to Professor Ogawa. Just briefly, before joining the ADBI, he taught population economics at institutions such as Nihon University's College of Economics, the University of Tokyo's Graduate School of Economics, and the University of Malaya's Faculty of Economics and Public Administration. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii. He's written extensively on population and development in Japan and other Asian countries. So, Professor Ogawa.
Thank you.
Put that fairly close to you.
Closer. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, at present, almost 80% of Asian populations are living in societies with below replacement of fertility. 80% of Asian people living in the society with below replacement level of fertility. So low fertility is no big deal in Asia. It's all over. Of course, low fertility tend to induce the population aging. As a result, we get a bunch of, whoops, doesn't move. I want to move to the next. Oh, yeah, here. Okay, as listed here, we get a bunch of warnings coming from the various Asian countries with regard to population aging. To cope with these problems, about 20 years ago, the Economist came up with a new theoretical framework called National Transfer Account, and I was one of the the researchers supported this project from the very beginning of this project. And right now, more than 100 countries participating in this global project. And in Asia, 25 countries participating in this project. Once you join in this project, you have to estimate countries' most important graph shown here. The blue line indicates the labor income profile, age specific profile of labor income. Green one refers to the age-specific profile of consumption. Within this consumption, there are two components. One is private consumption, the other one is public consumption. And everything in this graph is connected with national income account. So with the change in something in the age structure, we can link to the national income account system. That's the idea behind this national transfer account. And then we have a national income account, the most important graph here. And then I try to relate this one to the lower graph with the life cycle deficit. And the children and the elderly have a deficit, and the working age population has surplus. And these deficits has to be financed by the surplus in this way, through public private transfers, or if that's not enough, they use the asset-based reallocation, which means savings. And then these are actually changes in Japan's most important graph over the last 25 years. And these it's expressed in terms of real constant yen and constant prices. It's a real growth. So it grows quite a bit. And that, I want to call attention to the older age groups, that at the end, after year 2000, it started rising more than before, because of the government introduced the long-term care insurance in year 2000. Okay, I want to show you how the Japanese, intergenerational transfer pattern changed over the last 25 years. This is the 1984 situation. And then here, this the children get the green one means that they get the money from the parents, familial transfer. And the blue one refers to the government transfer. And the same applies to the elderly person here. The elderly gets some resources from the family, the green one represent that. And then blue one covers the government resources. And then dark blue means they have their own, and elderly in Japan have some money, so they use their own assets. That's how they finance their deficits. This is 1984. But okay, I'll go real quick. Next 25 years, Japan changes dramatically. So don't blink, I'll go fast. 84, 89, 94, 99, 2004, 2009. What a dramatic change, dramatic change. And now, I'll call attention to this. Back in 1984, the elder getting supports from the families from age 64, okay, keep that in mind. But 25 years later, 81, Japanese elderly are quite wealthy, so they don't really depend on the families. So this means, that's the end of the story, I almost forgot. The elderly actually get some resources back to the grandchildren or children. And then in Japan, the elderly are playing the role of society safety net. particularly since the bursting of bubble economy in the early 1990s. So in Japan, the cost of early has been rising, and so is the case of the cost of children, as shown in the following graph. Yeah, children, to raise the kids from the age 1 to the age 23, you need 10 years of mean labor income, to cover the deficits, 10 years of income. Elderly, they need 8 years of income to support their retirement life. But this is 1984, but 25 years later, different. Children, they need 14 years of labor income, not 10 years, 14 years, more expensive now. And they only needs 15 years, not 8 years, almost doubled. So both children as well as the elderly needs more resources to support their lives. And I want to call attention to the children component. And I actually calculated, I plotted this in this graph to the cost of children. In other words, the education and health costs divided by standardized by the mean labor income for various Asian countries, and fit a regression like this. And then I was a bit surprised. This elasticity is minus 1.48, which is way, way bigger than the US. East Asia, 1.48, US minus 0.72. This means in Asia, the parents really substitute quality and quantity. Much the magnitude compared to the American or compared to the other NTA countries. And then this is the reason why, I call this the Asia is a success-oriented society. Parents want to spend any amount of money, for the sake of the children. That's the reason why the fertility has been declining in East Asia. For instance, if you look at the educational costs, in Sweden here, 3.1% of the education cost is paid by the parents out of their pocket, parents' cost. But China, 71% of the costs are paid out of their parents' pocket. Of course, the parents can afford them having more children. One is maybe enough. That's the reason why fertility has been falling in Asia. So Asia, particularly the East Asia, has this very unique pattern. I attended a conference in the US and talking about low fertility in Korea. The Korean has the same problems. They really go for the quality of children rather than quantity. So, but it's nice to have kids, with great quality and so on and so forth. So maybe we can really depend on them. But there's a warning. I'm a bit worried. The value shift. According to the Mainichi newspaper, they started collecting this data since 1950. And this is the only data available in the entire world. And the question is directed to the mothers of reproductive age below age 50. Question is, are you going to rely on children for old age? Look here, back in 1950, when Japan was still recovering from the World War II, 2/3 of mothers said, yes, I'm going to depend on children for old age. But keep on falling. After the 1961, when Japan established the universal coverage of pension and medical care services, keep on falling. Virtually, only a few percent of the mother said, yes, I'm going to down children for old age. But interesting thing is this, we ask another question to the same respondents. Okay, how about looking after parents? Almost all, they're right here. The early 1960s and 70s, these respondents said, almost 80% of them said, yes, it's a good custom or natural duty to take care of the parents. Very positive. Well, that's the reason why Japanese government said in the white paper on health in 1978, on the page 105, it says, aging is not a problem for Japan because we have a multi-generation living arrangement. And actually, these elder people can be looked after by the family members. That's what they said. But by taking advantage of that, the 1986, the government introduced the long-term, the in-home care, not the hospital worker. Government can afford anymore to pay for the high hospitalization costs. So all of a sudden, this value changed overnight. When I got this result, I almost got a heart attack. I thought I made a mistake in wording the questions, but the wording is the exact same over these 50 years. wording the same, sampling framework is same, but this sudden shift. So I'm a bit worried. I mean, if this happens, the government, got stuck. So I think government trying to strengthen the family. Till that time, the government, public transfer was the main thing. And then after this, they try to depend on the family care. But in other words, shifting responsibility to families, but more and more elderly persons are living alone. And then recently, it went down further in 2018. Only 20% of the mothers of reproductive age below 50 says, yes, it's good cause of natural duty. So value has been shifting dramatically over the last 70 years. Dramatic shift, I mean, demographic shift is fast, but value shift is even faster. I think not many people know this. I think we should call this attention to the policymakers. I mean, they really pay attention to this. If it's open, and on top of that, it's an overnight shift. Or the change in policies on the part of the government, value can change. Okay, now these are sort of, I forgot one more thing. Okay, because of the value, the value has been changing. The government now emphasize from the to the community-based support. But community support system is quite new for Japan. So a lot of problems to solve to seek that approach. Okay, now to really some of the population aging problems, the new approach I'm proposing is this. Maybe I think Dr. Kikkawa pointed out in her presentation, untapped work capacity. I calculated for Japan using the survey data, and this is the employment retirement age, but this is the labor force participation rate of the Japanese elderly persons. And I paid attention to these people like the 50s. I calculated the labor force participation rate of this particular age group in the 50s, in health and education, so on and so forth. I use that result and apply to the 60s and 70s. If they behave just like in the 50s in Japan, what happened? How many people can be in the labor force? Look, these many people can't go into the labor force. It's huge. I calculated the net effect of these additional workers, depending on what kind of wage rate you apply. Of course, the result is different, but if you applied ongoing market rate, Japan's GDP capita will increase about 6%. Even in the case of the minimum wage is applied to the 3.2% growth of GDP, which is quite substantial. And I call this a silver dividend or third dividend. If I have time, I'll talk about it more about dividend, but I think I'll see. Okay, another point I would like to raise to rectify this population aging situation is that I'm proposing that we should really introduce into this country remeasuring the population aging by using cognitive function. And I calculated cognitive function of the Japanese people together with the cognitive function for other countries listed here, using the very famous survey called the Heisei Retirement Survey. In Japan, we call it Japan a J-star. And then we ask a question like, okay, we give them 10 words. And right after that, how many words can you remember? Here, this is here, 5. 5 means they can remember 5 words out of 10. That's not too bad. These are the changes by age. And around the year 2010, and the US is number 1, way top, and then Northern Europe, and then Japan is right here. And Japan is fairly close to continental level. And then some other Asian countries have a lower level, like a People's Republic, China, so on and so forth. And then Japan is way better than the Southern Europe. In fact, Japanese case is very close to Germany and France. In fact, a little bit lower than Germany, but a little bit higher than France. But anyway, I introduced this cognitive score to the total population, and then age structure, and they recalculated cognition adjusted dependency ratio. And Japan is 0.22, and the US 0.10. Well, US is much younger. But Japan is close to the continental European level, like a 0.18. So I'm saying, I'd like to share this finding with the Japanese business leaders. I haven't really advertised this finding yet, but I think if the Japanese leaders, business leaders know this, maybe we're wasting so many resources right now. So we should keep aware of this important finding, among the business leaders. And then other thing is that the global burden, the health, another important possible solution to the aging is introducing the health component in the computation of dependency ratio. And the Asian Development Bank, my institute, is now working on this project using the data called the Global Burden of Disease Study. And we're trying to have an international conference at the end of this year. And finding this survey covers the 204 countries and covering 369 diseases. And over the period of like 1990 to 2021, for a long time, by age and sex. So they have a huge amount of resource, huge amount of data for various ages, various diseases, and so on. So, you can calculate the changes in the number of days that they lose over this time period, and so on and so forth. So, finding is this. Okay, in this graph, I'm showing this age dependency ratio based on the conventional chronological age. I think everybody uses this, 65 and over in the total population. That's quite commonly used since 1916. We've been using this almost more than 100 years. Although at the time, life expectancy was only 40, but it's now 80 plus. Dramatic change, yet we're still using some definition. But okay, this is the conventional chronological age. But once you adjust for the health for these elderly persons, situation is different. Look, Japan is right here. Once we adjust for our age structure by health conditions, Japan is quite young, younger than Russia, younger than EU, younger than the US, even younger than India. I got shocked when I look at the results. This is the truth, been published. We should know that Japan, people talk about Japan is the oldest country, and Japan is really hopelessly, rapidly aging. That's true, but if you adjust for the health situation, is completely different. We need new perspectives about our future. I think I would like to call attention that we need remeasuring the population aging so that we can come up with different approaches, different policy options. I think we don't have this idea in this country yet. Okay, well, so many things. I think I'm running out of time. I think I better stop here. 3 minutes. Okay, here. Okay, I want to call attention to the top one. I think Dr. Kikkawa pointed out that the ADBI's approach is the lifelong approach, but I think I'll go for very similar, but I call it life course approach. Look at the top one, Helsinki course study. According to this study, if the child is born before 37 weeks of pregnancy, 37 weeks of pregnancy, it's called preterm, and as opposed to full term. If the baby is born a preterm, and then this baby have the cognitively some problems. They actually covered the 1934 and the 1944 birth cohorts, and 17 years later, they had a cognitive test around the year 2000. They found that there's differences between these two groups. Those who were born preterm have some lower cognitive performance level. But trick is this: if they had a proper education, no difference. So although when they're born, they have a preterm or some handicap, but by providing a proper follow-up policy, the treatment, I think no difference. They could be just as productive as the full-term cases. And also at the ADBI here, I think we're the only one doing now, but I think we're conducting bottom nutrition height we're testing this. We're paying attention to the Japan's school lunch programs. We started back in 1950s up to the mid-1960s but each prefecture introduced the school lunch program at different point in time. So we're trying to measure the impact of the differences in the timing of the introduction of the school lunch programs on the cognitive function. We have a work history data for the elderly persons. We can find out if these differences in timing of school lunch programs really affected cognitive function of the Japanese elderly person. This is quite challenging, big challenge for us. But I think that's going to be a very, very. I'm really looking forward to the finding the new coming and actually completing the study. Then I would like to share this finding with you later on. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Concluding remarks: the population aging is not destiny. Population aging defines various possibilities. What do we choose? Political leadership counts. That's exactly what we need in this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As someone who's reached a certain age myself, I take great comfort in your remarks. Right, let's turn to Jesper, who I think it's fair to say has long been recognized as one of the top Japan strategists and economists, having worked as chief strategist and head of research for US investment banks JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch. He currently serves as expert director for the Monex Group and for the Japan Catalyst Fund. Jesper, please.
Great. I mean, first of all, I want to, thank and commend the previous speakers. Absolutely fantastic. Great to hear that there's a silver dividend. And as a German, it's very good to hear that the cognitive capabilities of Germans are better than the French, which is, very, very important. And, Japan can take the middle ground, which is, always very nice. I want to sort of change gear a little bit, and look at it, at aging specifically here in Japan, from a practitioner's perspective, in the sense of I look as the aging dynamics here in Japan as actually a catalyst for some very positive change and positive opportunities here. Specifically, I want to talk about industrial restructuring that comes from the demographics, from the aging. I want to talk about the wealth transfer that happens, the unlocking of the savings surplus that the household sector has amassed. And then last but not least, the shortage of labor, the shortage of skills actually empowers the next generation. And as you know, I actually want to be reborn as a 23-year-old Japanese, because it has become, now a very tight labor market, and that is a great thing for the younger generation. Now, let's take these, sort of very quickly. As you know, when you look at corporate Japan, there is approximately 3.6 million incorporated enterprises here in Japan, right? And this is the real thing. We're not talking about the Keidanren, we're not talking about the listed companies, we're talking about the real thing, the belly of the beast. 3.6 million. 2.6 million of those 3.6, the majority owner and president CEO is now 70 years or older. And of those 2.6, where the president and majority owner is over 70, 1.6 do not have somebody who will take over. Musuko, musume, son, daughter, doesn't want to do that business. So what will happen? And I was very interested. I mean, as you know, unfortunately, when you're over 70, what is it now? You've got a 1 in 6 chance of developing Alzheimer, right? Or some form of dementia over the next decade, right? And so what you actually see is that the generational transfer doesn't happen. As a result of that, businesses are for sale. And the big driver of the boom in mergers and acquisitions, that we've seen accelerating over the last 3 or 4 years. Not in the listed companies. I'm not interested in Hitachi here. We're talking about the real industrial structure, where small and medium-sized companies, family-owned enterprises, that's where the streamlining, is going on. And from an economist perspective, that actually, points in a very positive direction, because Japan does have over-competition. Right? There are way too many players in many of the things. It's one of my favorite statistics. Japan has 490,000 wholesalers, of whom, right, barely 12% have a customer who is a consumer or a retailer. So it's a it's a multi-structured distribution system. This now starting to go out because of demographics being the catalyst for industrial reorganization, for industrial streamlining. The second element is the generational transfer of money. I mean, it's wonderful. As you know, what's the difference between Japan and China? The difference is Japan got rich before it got old. I mean, you are looking at a country that for 37 years running is the world's largest creditor country. This thing is unbelievably rich. This is the richest baby boom generation on earth. And so what will happen now is, again, give or take over the next decade, given that the people over 70 own about 60% of all the net financial assets in Japan, you will actually find that because of death, I'm sorry, that's why people don't like economists, because we talk about death. Nothing to be afraid of, right? But, this chochiku kajo, this excess savings pool, what is going to unstuck it now is inheritance. And of course, the Ministry of Finance wants 50%, and will probably do all it can to take those 50%. But, over the next decades, it's about 1.2, 1.3 times GDP that is being transferred from the wealth, right? So, even if half of that goes to pay down debt, that's still a significant amount of money, of assets that is actually becoming available. Right? And this generational transfer, again, for somebody who works in finance, creates enormous opportunities because these people need advice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So that's something where, from a policy perspective, I was very interesting. I actually think that there is actually some work that can be done in terms of the gift taxation system and the inheritance taxation system to actually streamline and incentivize that generational transfer here in Japan. I mean, as you know very well, it's nice to say, there's so much money that's going to be transferred, but then the average age of the people who inherit the money is in their early 60s. Right? So actually to have an economic impact or a more positive economic impact, maybe you need to do a generation skipping and do a 2-generation gift tax acceleration system. That's something that certainly is something that ought to be potentially considered. And then last but not least, this empowerment of the youth, right? Japan has, a labor shortage. It's absolutely correct that obviously, the rules and regulations as well as corporate practices can do much more to empower and utilize, right, the silver dividend. That is there, absolutely no question. But at the front end, at the intake level, the fact that the number of high school and university graduates is shrinking structurally. As a result of that, it has become a seller's market. I'm selling my labor. And my friend, who is the head of HR at Mitsubishi, now every time he does a recruiting round, he is crying. Because 6-7 years ago, it was the young men and women from Keio University, from Waseda University, from Tokyo University, begging him to hire them. Now they sit in front of him and said, what's Mitsubishi going to do for me? Right? And as you know, it's interesting, people look at the shunto, which is nice, the base up level. If you look at starting salaries for listed companies, they're actually increasing at a rate of around 15% right now. So, you actually do see that the price mechanism, the scarcity, forces changes, which again, from an investor's perspective, are extremely interesting. And my favorite example is the reality of NTT, which for all intents and purposes is Japan's one of the largest unionized companies in Japan. They now, since last year, have introduced a break with pay for with seniority-based pay. They're introducing genuine pay for performance, which again, from an economist or certainly from an investor's perspective, increases the probability that real productivity increases are actually starting to come through. And in all this debate, I want to put one thing out. I was once on one of these government committees, and we started talking about the pension system, and you can talk about the pension system in incredible complications. What if your actuarial return is 8.2% as opposed to 8.7%, blah, 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 right? The reality is that the best pension system is to ensure that our children have a job that earns twice as much as we did. That's what a stable pension system is. And the irony is that here in Japan, because of the demographics, right, actually, the demand and supply condition in the labor market are forcing now proud corporate practices, proud corporate employment practices to be changed, become more rational, more, productivity-based compensation system. That, I think, is something that's very, very interesting. So let me stop here and look forward to, receiving your questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. A lively presentation, Jesper, as usual. Okay, let's turn to questions from the floor first. Do we have a question or online? If not, perhaps I could just ask a very general question. But we've all said that for long Asia has been. We've talked to the Asian miracle, and now, of course, that miracle began when Asia was still relatively young. Asia, and I'm being very general here, is aging. So is that going to mean that the miracle comes to an end, or has productivity generally risen to a sufficient extent that even with a smaller population, Asia can still be the miracle region, if you like? Aiko-san, could I turn to you first on that, because you have this study you've done?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. So we did not look at particularly on the productivity of the entire this report was focused more on the micro level of all the person, but we did such study in the past. So I think miracle does exist, but then a country has to do more, maybe is the one answer. So you would see some good examples like Singapore, where productivity has gone up with a good investment on the education, to infrastructure, to government policies, which then leads to success, even above the Japan's GDP. So you would see those success. At the same time, there are some countries that are still struggling with what we call a middle income trap, and that the quality of education, infrastructure still remains to be a challenge. And by the fact that their resource would be taken up more on the health and pension expenditures and so on, can jeopardize their growth. And there's no doubt about that. Another issue is that they are a segment of groups, society that have experienced large productivity growth in terms of the human capital, but then inequality is quite stark. So you would have sort of as I mentioned, in all the workforce, you have very productive workforce who are generating good wealth to the country, but you will still have an almost large number of people who did not have access to good education and would not be able to achieve the promise that they could have offered to the country. So this gap also has to be addressed, and there's a good potential there.
Okay, thank you. Ogawa-san, do you want to make a quick comment on that?
Well, I think, I briefly talk about the first dividend when I was presenting this morning. But, the NTA, there are three dividends. One is the first democratic dividend. When the fertility falls, the relative size of the working age population increased. That's we call it the first democratic dividend. You have more workers. You can produce more the products. So, but the point is that it's not going to last long. I mean, eventually, it lasts only 20 years or so. And then after that, aging comes in. In fact, in Asia, I would say that there are several countries still enjoying the first democratic dividend. Japan ended the first democratic dividend in 1982, and after that, we got this bubble economy, and it boosted bubble economy followed. But actually, taking the country like Malaysia, their first democratic dividend ends in 2030. But that's not the end of the Malaysian case. After that, they can utilize a second democratic dividend. What's second democratic dividend? By using a first democratic dividend, they started building up the pension funds. They did huge assets built up. And by investing this money in the foreign countries, they're making quite good money. So in other words, second democratic dividend, it could be eternal, permanent, by managing these assets in a smart way. So all I'm saying that the Asia's future is pretty much the policy to be adopted by the government. You know, they have a first democratic dividend, they should come up with the strong employment policies and use the affluent bulging labor force. But in the second, when it comes to second dividend, I mean, the country should manage these funds in a smart way so that they can keep on increasing their capital stock. And the third democratic dividend, which is the case of Japan, and the civil dividend, you know, it really depends on the country, you know, how to utilize these workers. I mean, you know, in the case of Germany, in fact, they did it smart way. They actually implemented the policy between 1980 and 2000. They actually hit this target group like 30 to 40s. And then the 10 years, you know, they gave us some training, specific input for these workers. In fact, 10 years later, their income increased dramatically, and the productivity increased. And on top of that, I was shocked. You know, our cognitive function tend to decline once you get old, but these workers, you know, the liquid intelligence tend to not going to increase that much once you get older. Normally, the crystallized intelligence, but in this case, the liquid intelligence improved, which is surprising. And on top of that, in the case of Australia, it's a very interesting case. There's some women retires, but their cognitive function improved, in particular liquid asset. How come these Australian women become even better than before? Because they're autonomy. They become more independent after retirement. So I think the people think that, you know, the liquid intelligence goes down with age, but no, there's some exceptions. And in fact, there's some positive signals coming. By utilizing these possible options, I mean, we can increase our productivity by using these elderly persons.
Interesting perspective. Yes, but you want to make a comment? Or?
No, look, I mean, I think the interesting thing is, again, I mean, that, you know, the Asian policymakers, I mean, everybody's on to this, right? This is not as though, oh my God, all of a sudden there's this aging problem. I mean, you know, the fact that you've got, you know, Japan as an example, that you've got Germany as an example, and everybody, you know, is studying this very, very carefully. And I think, you know, is it true that there is an easy part, you know, the resource mobilization part, you know, of Asia's growth miracle, that's probably close to an end, right? But it would be absurd to argue that these countries, these policymakers will not build, you know, the capital infrastructure, the social infrastructure, to actually cope with this quite successfully.
Okay. Yes, please. If you could come to the microphone and identify yourself, please.
Thank you. Rocky Swift at Reuters. Thank you very much for the presentations today. I had a particularly heartless editor who would boil down any issue, war, peace, demographics, with what's the trade? So given these kind of demographic changes that we can all see coming before us, what sectors, companies, assets would the investor buy or short, given everything that we're seeing right now? Thank you.
Okay, Jesper, you take that first.
Okay, number one, Japanese financial services. You know, huge beneficiaries, right, of the structural transfer of wealth, right? So the Japanese asset management industry, you know, if you want to be specific about it, right? You know, huge beneficiary. I mean, you know, the biggest industrial restructuring that is tangible, you know, where there's liquid assets, is that you'll find that Japan's secondary banking system, right, the regional banks and the Shinyo Kyokai and all these wonderful, what are they called, credit unions, you know, there'll be a massive M&A wave, right, streamlining this, and, you know, you want to place a bet that these are going to end up being better companies, right, fewer players, right, you know, in in what is still an extremely wealthy market there. The second point, I think, is that anything that actually deals, right, with domestic experiences, right, and this is very specifically to Japan, because the Japanese baby boom generation is the richest baby boom generation on earth. So if you can create experiences for that, right? Now, it's not about inbound tourism. And of course, a marginal buyer of tourism, right, is going to be, the rise in the Asian middle class. But the domestic opportunities, and this was wonderfully documented in the data, I've never seen this clearly expressed, right? That the Jichan-bachan, right? That the baby boom generation actually is a big, contributor, right? To the basically the third to the third generation down, right? So, for example, in the travel industry, if you look at a company like Hoshinoya, right, a big part of their business is actually the travel, where now the rich, as it were, right, grandparents who now have time because they're no longer a salaryman, right? They now have time and they travel, with the grandchildren for 3 days, and on the last day, Mama and Papa joins, right? But Mama and Papa, are salaryman, so they don't have the full time. So specifically, Japanese financial services and anything that deals with Japanese experiences, right? Call it the service sector.
No, I think one thing I would like to call your attention is that, in Japan, I think the inter vivos component has been increasing. I think we have not really covered in our analysis. I think that's going to be more important. You talk about inheritance, but I think inter vivos transfer has been increasing important.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Aiko-san, Kikkawa-san, do you want to make a comment on that? Which sectors are most investable given the demographic trends? If you don't, it's okay, but... Hello, can you hear me?
I have difficulty getting the sound, sorry.
Okay. You want me to ask the question again?
Yes, please.
Which, this one or this one? It doesn't matter. Well, the question was which sectors, are most investable, if you like, given the demographic trends. I mean, if you care to make a comment on this, then please do. If you don't, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. I thought the previous question, I thought you had a new question. In terms of I don't comment on the capital market, but perhaps on the industry side, there are some trend that in terms of the labor market, it would very much be the health and the hospitalities and other care economies that would be expected to grow. And those are very labor-intensive industries that would take up many of the workforce. So if you're in the rural area of Japan, you would see that the major industry that hire people are those sectors, and it's increasingly so. So you might see the shift in terms of the compositions of the industries, if not the how capital market would work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dan.
Dan Sloan, freelance. Thanks very much for very provocative discussion and not as dire as I expected. But looking at just the news this week, there was a story in the Asahi saying in the first 3 months of this year, 17,000 seniors died by themselves, and prorated out, the number is like 70 to 80,000 over the course of this year. That doesn't, while there are silver dividends going on and potential there are also aspects of this situation or imbalance, demographic or otherwise, which I think have implications for public services, infrastructure, particularly in rural areas that are seeing hollowing out of industries, seeing migration to bigger cities, and who's left primarily the elderly. So I was wondering if you could put into context, I always think about municipalities that are facing bankruptcy in Japan, and the government's response is basically, you figure it out, or you merge with somebody else, or you come up with your self-survival plan. And to me, that's almost the same thing as having a nation where 20,000 people die by themselves. So I guess not painting a too dark picture here, but what if you're in, say, rural Tohoku or Shikoku somewhere, and you're seeing your population decline and the people who are left are elderly, how do you manage that?
Ogawa-sensei, would you like to start off on the silver debit, if you like?
Well, first of all, I'd like to call the attention to this. Well, according to some of the surveys done in this country, we asked the elderly person, how often do you have contact people outside, or in the community and so on and so forth. In other words, those who have a lot of contacts with the neighbors and so on and so forth, they're supposed to be very happy. But I think that's very misleading. Not how many friends, how many contact points they have, but what type of relationship they have. Type, quality of the relationship. That's what we really have to assess. Maybe they may have contacts with the neighbors, but maybe the quality of communication might be problematic. I think we should really explore that possibility. Although I said that during my presentation, the government is trying to promote the community-based support, but I think really quality of communication is quite important for these elder persons, particularly living alone. In Tokyo, the 20% of elder persons living alone, a male living alone. I'm the one of them, actually. I'm living alone. So this is a very serious problem. So I think communication with the neighbors, particularly quality of communication, is quite important to solve the problem of this loneliness and so on and so forth.
Quick comment?
No, Dan, you're absolutely right. There's enormous changes in society. I mean, outside of the 5 major urban areas, you cannot have a natural birth anymore. You have to schedule it because there's a shortage in the inaka, in the countryside, of obstetricians, right? So yes, there's enormous changes and enormous pressures that are coming through there, right? Now, I would argue, the other way around, in the sense of that's a very positive thing, right? Because that, yes, is painful, maybe from a human perspective, right? And obviously it would be a better world if you had nobody dying alone, right? But when you actually go into the countryside, you actually do see that there are younger politicians seizing the opportunity, coming up with much more innovative ideas, doing things that go against whatever Kasumi Gaseki at the national government sort of shows up. I just gave a presentation to the board of Microsoft, and I learned something very interesting, that rural Japan, for the public sector, is the fastest adoption of AI tools, which is very interesting because, the yakusho, the local bureaucracy, they don't have the people. So if you have a tech-based solution, that helps you fill out forms, which is what this is, right? They adopt it much faster than anywhere else in the world, which is very interesting, right? So yes, it's painful, absolutely. Growing old, I mean, look, I don't have any hair, right? Growing old, yes, you got to adopt, right? But I think that, from a practical perspective, and I come back to this point, is this a catalyst for change, to actually change some of the old ways and the traditional and proud ways that particularly here in Japan, right? And it was very interesting, right? To your point, you're absolutely right. I mean, why do we define the workforce as 15 to 65? I mean, where does this come from? Why do we have pension age, at 65, which was set up when Bismarck, was running Europe? And so it's quite interesting. And this dialogue and this change, I think, happens actually very fast. Okay. And Professor, you're going to correct me on this, but roughly speaking, right? People over 65, right, are now what? About 1/3, right, of Japan, right? They're 1/3 of Japan. They're 18% of consumer spending. And they are 60% of voting. So it's interesting that one of the things that actually happens that we didn't touch upon here is that in a democracy, right, the reality, right, of youth disengagement, right, because a lot of the public debate focuses, what do we do to the old? Because, by the way, I'm old. Distracts and actually prevents our focus on what we actually should be focusing on, which is empowering the younger generation. Because the younger generation, like I said, is much more, sorry, I mean, everybody's important, right? But at the end of the day, you know, when you look, I mean, it's just a reality. Everybody who wins a Nobel Prize, you know, basically they all make their discovery and do their work when they're in their 20s, right? They get the Nobel Prize when they're in their 60s, right? You know, society has a way of doing this. But the point I'm trying to make is sort of food for thought in the sense of that, yes, aging is an issue. Yes, aging can become a catalyst, can become a burden. It forces, you know, all sorts of debate. But we must be very, very careful that we do not forget that at the end of the day, the next generation, the younger generation, is what's going to create wealth and prosperity.
Thank you. Okay. Motoko Rich has a question, I believe. Can you go ahead?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for doing this presentation. I had a question for Ogawa-san, because the most shocking data, I know Jesper was pleased to see that Germany exceeds France, but I was, as an American, I was frankly shocked to see that on the cognitive scores, the US looked fairly substantially higher than Japan. And then you showed the other slide that showed how much younger Japan would be despite its sort of chronological age profile based on actual health. And I know you're an economist, not a neurologist, but I've heard that Japan has the highest rate per capita of dementia in the world, which is partially corresponding to the pure number of aging folks in Japan. But I'm curious why this delta between physical health and cognitive health in Japan, which I frankly found pretty surprising.
What was the last one?
Of course, the difference between physical health and high rate of dementia. I mean,
Well, you know, I think ADBI, our institute, is now, that's the main project, and we're estimating the number of demented elderly persons in Japan. I think government made an announcement recently, but I think the estimate is a bit problematic. I think, you know how many places they gather the data from? And only 4 towns with a population, one of them is less than 1,000, tiny population. You know, I mean, we needed a more national representative sample to make a total estimates for the elderly person. In fact, our institute is trying to use a big data, more pharmaceutical-based data to make estimates for the entire cognitive, demented cases. So my feeling is that maybe the number of demented elderly persons in Japan will be substantially different from the government estimates. And not only that, I mean, maybe mild cognitive impairment case will be also different. But I'm saying that, so I think, you know, I know we're going to have a lot of the demented cases, but I think the actual number, I don't know. I think that remains to be very carefully analyzed. And in fact, we need that more reliable estimate as quickly as possible. And because the government, according to during the Abe administration, dementia was one of the most priority areas. But at that time, the base for the statistical base for the policy formulation was very, very weak, not the scientifically based on the evidence. I would say that I think we can come up with a more reliable estimate. That make the entire prospect very different.
Sorry, my question was more about the gap in your slides. You showed that in terms of physical health, the Japanese are extremely healthy, but that in cognitive health, they were not as healthy as the Americans, it just seems like there's a gap between physical health and cognitive health. And if you're talking about the silver dividend, I think you need cognitive health in order to be employable, no?
Well, actually, I don't know exactly why the American got such a high score, but I think basically using the same the health retirement survey framework, I mean, that's what they found. But possibly, I think nutrition condition is different. Also, the exposure to the
So-
digital things, also the health conditions is another factor. But the interesting thing is that there's some selectivity bias, depending on the country. Like in my presentation, you might have noticed that India has a very good cognitive function among elderly persons because of some selectivity. Those who reach the age 70 and 80 in India, they're well fed. I mean, nutrition-wise, they have a good life. So, there's some selectivity bias. So the inter-country comparison of this cognitive function or health data is we have to be very careful what kind of some selectivity bias exists in the data set.
Quick comment.
No, I was going to say on the health side, I guarantee. I mean, again, I don't know the data set, but I'm sure that obesity is a big factor,
Well, that's
right?
true, yeah.
And as a result of that, the Americans lose out.
I would like to just make one quick question about, we haven't talked about the fiscal impact of aging. I'm putting it very crudely. I mean, are we all going to have to pay higher taxes to deal with this problem? Aiko-san, perhaps you could just say something briefly about which countries face a particular fiscal burden as a result of rapid aging and population decline.
Right. I think the physical space will be pressured from several fronts, but just talking about the pension side, countries that have defined benefit, meaning if you contribute X amount, we're going to give you Y amount. The country that have this kind of system, including many of the civil service pension, would face an issue unless otherwise some reforms are introduced. Some countries have already done that, but others haven't. In this report, we highly recommend sort of indexing or automatically adjusting like pension payout or the retirement age by the longevity or the country's contributory status of the pension, and those can help. But some countries have under large political pressure or constraint to make that move, and that we do expect it to see more catastrophic impact on that if they keep the current some of the current pension system going, and we really has to go on contributory and defined contribution type of the pensions.
I know you don't always like to identify countries, but are there any countries, China for example, that face particular problems in this regard?
China, they have recently reformed in terms of the pension system to introduce broader coverage of the pension. So, it's called matching. They use what they call matching funds. So, even the people in the rural sector can contribute, an employer would match, and the government would match. And it's been quite helped to increase the pool of contributor. But I think they still have issues on the government pensions because it's quite incremental, and that there hasn't been much reform. And it's very difficult to reform because changing the pensionable age or others have other implications like health entitlement and other whole set of things. Then this would involve the entire change of the system. And I think a large country like PRC would need a lot of resource to do this massive reform, which kind of make them hesitant to take on. But I think they're really exploring that.
Quick comment? No? Jesper?
The question is whether I think the threat of higher public burden through taxes or through increased social security contribution or pension contribution is obviously there. It's very large here in Japan. The question is whether policymakers can actually use modern technology and modern identification to actually be a little bit more clever rather than using broad-based tax increases. What I'm talking about specifically is means testing. Right, that people who do have assets, who don't have a mortgage, their jikofitan, what is that called, the out-of-pocket expense, right? For example, for healthcare, why not increase in this? Why keep it, means testing is done on not an asset based, but effectively on an income base, which is kind of idiotic, right? Given that, there are so many very asset rich people who are income poor, right? But they certainly could afford, right? A higher out-of-pocket expense.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes literally left if anyone wants to ask a quick question. No? All right. Well, okay, well, we're at 9:59, so we are actually on time. Well, again, I'd like to thank the panelists. And as I always say, we only have time to scratch the surface in these debates. I think we have uncovered a lot of issues that need further discussion. So maybe we can have a further deep dive at some point in time on aspects of this. So thank you, Ogawa-sensei. Thank you, Aiko-san, very much for your participation. Thank you, Jesper. And please join me in thanking. Oh, well, before we do that, let me hand out the prizes, as it were. And this is a one-year honorary membership of the club. Thank you. Like Jesper, I think you've got several of these already.
It's a lottery ticket.
Okay, so please join me in thanking the panelists. That concludes the debate. Thank you very much.